Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. I'm joined today by the Scalf family. This is Pam Shade, who is a sister, Betty Scalf, who's mom, Lynn Scalf, who is a sister, Teresa Wooters, who is a granddaughter, and our expert, who is not related, David Nutting. He's retired Orange County homicide detective, now working in private enterprise. We are pleased to announce there's an old saying that it's better late than never. Well, this is late, but it's better late than never. Let me introduce you to Teresa Scalf. 37 years ago, on October 27th of this year, she was murdered. She was viciously murdered. She was only 29 years old, and she was viciously murdered by an unknown suspect. She had defensive wounds where she fought this suspect off, but he aggressively stabbed her and cut her. Now, I'm giving graphic details only because Mom said I could, because you don't mess with Mom, and I would never say this without her saying. He cut her head almost off. It was violent and it was horrible. There was a full investigation at the time to try to find who did this. Mom discovered her daughter and called us, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. Detectives worked on the case at the time. I remember the case vividly. We worked and we worked and we worked. Teresa at the time was a registered nurse at then Lakeland General Hospital, which is now Lakeland Regional Health. We never gave up on this case. We investigated it through the years, and I want you to clearly understand when this occurred in 1986, there was no DNA. There was no DNA genealogy. We knew that we had Teresa's blood, and we had another unknown source of blood, but there was no way to match that. Then in the 2000s, CODIS came along. So we took our suspect's blood that we'd run a DNA on and put it in the CODIS database, certain that we would get a hit for someone who would viciously murder this beautiful young lady. Nothing at all. And the investigation went on. We suspected a lot of people. We talked to a lot of people. There were literally thousands of hours of investigative work that went into this case. But as technology improved, one of our detectives, Matt Newbolt, who is not only assigned to homicide, but cold case homicide, had Teresa Scalf's photograph on his desk from early 2015. He said, I'm going to figure out who murdered Teresa. And that's exactly what he did. This is who murdered Teresa, Donald Douglas. He was 33 at the time of the murder. He's dead. He died of natural causes when he was 54 years old. He and his brother owned D&D Electric. His brother is also deceased. As it turns out, Donald lived behind Teresa. Detectives talked to Donald at the time of the event as they were doing neighborhood canvasses, but there was nothing at all out of the ordinary. We know that Matt worked with our colleague here that retired from the Orange County Sheriff's Office. He's going to talk to you. Othram is a private lab that does genealogy DNA. Matt, once he found out that we were able to work a genealogy on the DNA, had to trace this case back to 1949 when a third cousin to Donald Douglas had an affair and had a child not by her husband. So we traced DNA and genealogy back to 1949 and an illicit affair that led us in the direction of ultimately Donald Douglas. When we were able to work the genealogy up into the modern era, Matt met with Donald Douglas's son and said, hey, we'd like a blood sample. We're working a murder investigation. The son to Donald Douglas was totally cooperative and was in horrible shock. His dad, and here's the key to it, had never, ever, ever been arrested. Ever. Donald's son was certain that Matt Newbolt, Detective Newbolt, was just chasing another dead end because there was no way in the world his dad would murder anyone. But he cooperated because that's what good Americans do. He provided the DNA. We took it back to the lab. The lab said, hey, that DNA is the son of the person who did the murder. And that's how we found Donald Douglas. If it weren't for modern science, we still would wonder how in the world or who in the world murdered this beautiful registered nurse that worked in a trauma unit, saving lives, making people better, and died that fateful night. Words can't explain the graphicness and horribleness that we saw and that Mom discovered when she was called when her child didn't show up for work. Mom knew that wasn't how it was. But before we get to the family, I would like to ask David to come up and tell you a little bit about what he does, and then he turns that data over to the detectives, and we have to then do investigative legwork, which Matt Newbolt, and I asked Matt if he wanted to speak, and he said, no, I'm good, boss. He's going to be my subject matter expert anyway, and I'm going to bring him up and introduce him in a minute because he traced this back from 1949 and an affair with a third cousin between neighbors a long, long time ago. So David, come up and talk about that.
Thank you, Sheriff. Like the Sheriff said, my name is David Nutting. I work for Othram, a Texas-based lab that specializes in developing genetic samples from crime scene evidence and submitting that to law enforcement. And it's important to note that no case is solved by Othram. The cases are resolved, as the Sheriff said, by the hard work of law enforcement. Othram is grateful that we are trusted to provide actionable investigative leads to law enforcement in unresolved investigations. This has been achieved by Othram's proven technology, which has demonstrated success after success. Today's resolution represents the 106th publicly announced case resolution this year alone by Othram. Whenever there is any DNA available to potentially resolve cases, no matter how little or how bad the condition of the DNA, there is always a potential for case resolution. Othram is working through cutting-edge research and development to develop investigative leads for law enforcement agencies throughout the world. Teresa's family now has answers. The resolution of Teresa's murder continues to create awareness of the thousands of other unresolved homicides throughout the United States. The Murder Accountability Project reports from 1965 to 2021, there are over 330,000 unresolved homicides in the United States. The technology exists to resolve these cases. We're only limited by lack of funding. Othram will continue to work to raise awareness, increase funding, and bring resolution to cases throughout Florida. Thank you.
We're fortunate that we live in Polk County and we have a Board of County Commissioners that appropriately funds us to do our job. Because funding is not an issue when we're investigating and trying to solve homicides for people's family and bring murder suspects to justice. Now, I want to introduce to you Pam Shade, who I said once again is the sister of Teresa. Pam is a registered nurse, and she's had to live with this burden along with the rest of the family. At the same time, she goes to work every day and saves people's lives and works to make people well and heal people. Pam, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm Pam. I'm Teresa's second sister.
Stand right up here.
Thank you.
Talk in the microphone.
The first thing that I would like to say is Teresa was a wonderful person, the most loving person. She didn't deserve this. Our family didn't deserve this. My mother had just lost my brother of 23 years old, a year and a half before she discovered my sister's body in that condition. Can you even imagine what that would be? But she held it together. She made it to the phone because we didn't have cells back then. Found the number that my sister had hanging there for her 8-year-old son and was able to get the police there. My mother did that. I don't know how many people would have that much strength to do what she did. My sister signed me up for nursing school and said, "You'd be a good nurse." I had just gotten out of the military. I did not work in nursing. And I said, "No." She says, "Oh, just go take the test." I've been a nurse 38 years now, 38 years. Almost our whole family works in healthcare pretty much due to her. My brother is a trauma nurse. My sister works in mental health. My mother worked at the hospital for 25 years. All due to her. It was all due to her. She started off at the bottom, nursing assistant. She went to respiratory school and she got her RN and was so proud. I have never seen anyone more proud. She said, "I did it, Pam. I did it." And she was dead a month later after we had this conversation. It was very hard. There's a few things I would like to say. That my family wants to acknowledge law enforcement for everything they have done. They didn't give up. They didn't give up all these years. They just kept working, and we were called. I was notified. Detective Newbold especially would call and talk to me and say, "You know, what do you think about this?" or "How about this?" And I'm trying not to bother you, and I'm thinking, bother us, please. Please bother us. He was amazing. We would like to thank from the dispatch all the way to the detectives who have worked this case for 37 years. Putnell was the original detective, and then due to his diligence of saving the evidence back then when we didn't even have DNA, but he preserved it all those years ago. And from there it was Detective Van Sciver, and that was back in the 2000s, working the case diligently. And then Detective Newbold and his partner Jason took over from there in around 2015 and stayed on the case, and he kept her picture on his wall. And he told me, "I will not retire until I solve this case." And he did. He surely did. I would like to say the family has nothing to do with what the person that did this. I just really don't feel like he needs to be vilified or anything. The sins of the father, no. I think that family needs to be left alone. He cooperated, which is astounding. So many people didn't in her case. People who knew her refused to cooperate, which I will never understand. I'd like to thank Sheriff Grady-Judd, who has supported this investigation throughout. From day one, he has supported us and the investigation. We appreciate the whole team, And we hope that the knowledge provides comfort to everyone. Her co-workers, she was out with co-workers that day at lunch. She went to lunch. I hope it gives everybody comfort to know that we now know who did this. We know. We also would like to offer encouragement to other homicide victims. Don't give up. They don't give up. And as long as they don't give up, you don't give up. Don't give up. My family and I are moving forward in an attempt to just get past this. I don't know if my sister Lynn wants to say something very quickly. We would just like to thank everybody for the hours and hours that they put in on this. Thank you.
Now, Betty wasn't going to speak, but I don't know that I've ever met a stronger lady in my life, and certainly a stronger mother. Her son died in a diving accident in Itchinatuckney Springs, I believe, doing what 23-year-old kids do. They swim, they jump off of docks, and he broke his neck in a swimming accident. And then a year and a half later, she's the one that walked in and found her daughter, not just murdered, but horribly, horribly, horribly murdered. And it's this wonderful family and our passion to solve cases for the victims and to bring justice that caused us to never give up. But it really, really helps when the family never gives up. So Betty, would you come up here and speak to them for just a second from your heart?
All I want to say is I'm 84 years old. I lived to see this done. I think that's why I lived so long.
Matt, come on up. You got to meet the guy who put all of this together and never gave up. And he started explaining to me all the details that he had to go through in order to solve it. And I said, Matt, you're way over my head. But I want you to meet this detective who is simply the very best homicide detective that I've ever been around. And our entire team is outstanding. But he never, ever, ever, ever gives up on his cases. Give him a brief overview of what you did on this case, brother.
Thank you, Sheriff. My name is Matthew Newbold, and I work cold case, as you know, and during this case, I started working in 2015. In 2022, we partnered with the Othram Incorporated Lab. It gave us the ability to sort through family trees, which is a painstaking process in order to work our way down to the offender. And that's what we did in this case. It's a very long, painstaking process.
He had brown hair when all this started. Okay, that's great. I do want to say one statement from an editorial perspective. You know, every time we find a new technology to solve crimes, bring suspects to justice, and resolve cases for families, we're attacked. And as a result of being attacked for all the technology, I want you to know, had we not persevered and had this technology not been here, we would have never brought resolution of this horrible, horrible event to this family. And certainly the suspect is deceased and he can't be sent to prison for a long time. But my prayer is that he was in mental prison for what he did his entire life. And to give you an illustration of that, and I'm going to push Lynn to talk a little bit. Tell them about the bumper stickers on the car that was new technology at the day that people resisted. Come up here and tell them that new technology would have made a difference then, and ultimately it occurred, and now this new technology made a difference. But as a society, we've got to continue to do better to solve crimes, but more importantly, to prevent crimes from occurring. So tell them about the technology that Teresa had on her car.
Teresa was a very petite female, and she started working as a nursing assistant at 18. By the time she was about 21, 22, she was a phlebotomist. Then she became a respiratory technician and then a nurse, and she saw suffering. She used to cry when she had to stick babies for blood, and she cried when the teenagers came in car wrecks. She liked working as ICU because she provided comfort to those suffering and to their families. Back then, 911 was not universal. It had been around for a couple decades, but it wasn't real prevalent. And they were trying to get it on the ballot in Florida, and people were against it. It was government watching you, Big Brother, don't do it. There was a lot of conspiracy about it. She had 2 bumper stickers on her car. One said, "Vote for 911." The other one said, "Don't take your organs to heaven. Heaven knows we need them here." Because of the way she was killed and the length of time that passed between my mom found her, which was about probably 10 hours by guesstimates, she couldn't donate her organs. But she was the kind of person that if you asked her about something, she would engage in dialogue. So hopefully that encouraged some people to consider that pathway. There was no 911. When my mother, who was horrified by this thing that happened, she had to go to Teresa's refrigerator and find the little magnet that we used to have back then that had the sheriff's number on it, and then she had to have the presence of mind to call that and come up with my sister's address, and she'd only been to the house twice. Teresa hadn't lived there that long. So a lot has gone into this, and if you think back to the paranoia back then to 911, and you think about what we use it for today, which is a little bit of everything right down to complaints about your hamburger order, it wouldn't have made a difference in Teresa's case. But in cases where women and occasionally men are being violated by perpetrators, it's a rapid way to get to people. So we appreciate the DNA. I don't care how they get it. I don't care how they get it. I don't care if they use your DNA, 23andMe or whatever it's called. I don't care. Detective Putnell managed to get that evidence, and this gentleman and his company managed 37 years later to use that. We don't have closure for grief. There will never be closure when you have something this violent against a decent human being. It's not human. It's not humane. So for that, we will have no closure. But we have closure of questioning constantly, because when it's a deliberate act, you question everybody, her best friend, her ex-boyfriend, the cousins, anyone she's run into in the last 5 years. So all of this technology is here as a benefit, and I'm telling you, the only people complaining about it are those who don't want the technology used, and there's a reason for that. And I do want to say Matthew Newbold has been just amazing. The whole team was good, but I really can't say enough about what he and Jason did together. And Sheriff Judd, he allowed them to do what they needed to do. He gave them a lot of leeway, and many sheriffs would not have done that, and so we're so grateful. And that's all I want to say. Thank you for being with us to honor Teresa's memory today.
Acknowledge her, Teresa, please.
Thank you very much.
Acknowledge her granddaughter.
Yes, also we have our Teresa Wooters is the granddaughter of Teresa Scalf. She's here today. And she didn't have the opportunity to know her grandmother because of this horrific act. So at the end of the day, we can only hope that he suffered every day mentally for his horrible, horrible acts against this beautiful lady who went to work every day to save lives, to improve people's lives, and to care about folks. This is a classic example of how evil should never prevail, and we've got to all work together to keep that from occurring. Sure.
Do you have any sense of what the motive was?
We believe it was a sexual rejection. We think he had some interest in her sexually, and obviously she didn't have any. We saw a lot of defensive wounds. She never had a relationship with him. So we believe that he was angry and upset because she wouldn't have a relationship with him.
ever on your radar? Was he ever?
He was
questioned?
never on the radar. He was interviewed during the original neighborhood. He had the right answers. He didn't have any obvious injuries that we're aware of. And he was just one more of the neighbors we talked to. We talked to all of the neighbors in the area, and he didn't arouse any suspicion in the detectives at the time at all. Other people did. We investigated and investigated and investigated several people, and we ultimately were able to eliminate them because we just didn't have evidence. But this guy was never, ever on the radar.
Could I say something?
Yes, ma'am. Come up here.
I just need to say this. It was pouring down rain that day. It rained all day and it was
Come up
still
here
misty
so they
rain
can-
that night. All I want to say is it was
Come right up
raining.
here.
It was raining very hard all day, and it was still misty rain that night. It was just before Halloween, and because of the rain, people were not out. Usually the kids would be out playing, but it was raining. They were not out, and of course, by the time I think she was killed in around 3:30 in the afternoon, and by the time I got there at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, all the evidence had been washed away by the rain. That's why they had such a hard time trying to find him, because the rain had washed away everything, the blood, the footprints, everything. So they turned I was there. They turned the dogs loose. Dogs could do nothing. The rain had washed it all away. So the detectives have done a marvelous job. They have.
Can I say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Teresa had told us about some creepy neighbor that had showed up at her house with what looked like he had yanked a flower up out of the ground and slapped it into a pot. And he was sort of stalkerish. She had told us about him, but she'd never described him. So anybody, but especially ladies, if someone's being creepy, don't just tell your sisters. Tell them what he looks like. They knew. They went through that neighborhood repeatedly. Turned out the guy lived right behind her. She didn't know him. She didn't know his name. My mom worked at the hospital. It was much smaller back then. We all knew each other. I've worked there. My sister, my brother, we've all worked there. And when she didn't show up to work, they called my mom. My mom broke into my sister's house with a credit card. My mother's not a master thief. So if she could break into that house with a credit card, it wasn't really hard. I don't know if he was waiting for her. It would make sense based on what was there. She had gone out to lunch with friends and returned. My mom talked to her at the phone at 2:30. She said, go ahead and pick my son up from school. Mom took him home. She worked midnight shift. It wasn't unusual to fall asleep. And then when she didn't show up, Mom thought she went straight into work. But my point of all this is, if you are getting a creepy vibe, don't just tell your sisters, this creepy neighbor is doing weird things. Give a description. If we had had that description that the sheriff just showed you, that would have narrowed it right down. Large man, scruffy, 30-ish. Think what that would have done to the potential pool of suspects. So please, I'm looking around at a lot of women in here, and I do know men get stalked. And I do know guns equalize the odds. I also know they equalize the odds for us women in our favor.
Thank you.
What sort of evidence was preserved from the scene, though, after all these years that you all were able to collect that DNA?
That blood. That's when there's defensive wounds and when a knife shoots, you're obviously looking for scratches on the suspect. You're looking for where they possibly cut themselves. Obviously, he was cut in the process. There was blood. His blood was there. But they talked to this guy, and they didn't see anything. So, I mean, that's 30-something years ago, and I can tell you that we worked diligently then because she was a young lady. She was viciously murdered. This was not a lover's quarrel gone bad. It was abundantly evident that someone had horribly murdered this lady. So whenever the neighborhood was done, for whatever reason, there was no evidence other than his blood at the scene, which means he should have been injured, but they didn't see anything. But thank goodness the crime scene folks did a remarkable job, or we wouldn't have had anything today.
Could you tell us about him, who he was, what he did? Was he married, divorced?
At the time, he and his brother owned D&D Electric. He was an electrician. And he was not married, I don't think, at the time. And he had no arrest record, was on no one's radar. Matt, do you have other details about him?
No, sir, it's about it.
He was such a non-event, he didn't even get on the radar screen at all back in the day.
And so, was there forced entry into the house, or do you just think he got
They got into the house some way through, and I don't even remember. Matt, do you remember how? I don't remember those details.
What we could tell you is that there was no forced entry to the residence. And it was actually secured, like Betty said, when she got there.
Can you speak to the DNA itself? I mean, this was made possible through 23andMe and Ancestry.com, like those kinds of programs. And then how do you link it? You find out DNA that somebody lived nearby. How did that all work?
Well, without getting too much of the weeds on it, but yes, we use programs that we work with a genealogy company, and we basically build a family tree of DNA that people publicly put out there that we could use. So they have to opt into that. Not everybody has their DNA open to the public like that if you use 23andMe, but you can opt in to do that. And that's how we start building the family tree in a nutshell.
How was he related to this affair from 1949?
He's not related to that per se, but there was one of the distant family members, we were able to track that family line up to the Douglas family line and then connected them. So yes.
Meticulous. I mean,
Yes, it's
painstaking, I know.
Very painstaking, very difficult to sit here and explain. You'd have to look at charts and graphs, and you'd probably still get lost. But thanks to the help to the lab and the genealogist, and really thanks to the help to our sheriff and his staff for giving us the opportunity to be able to do that.
And that led you to identify the son?
Well, yes, we knew based on looking at the family tree, it led back to Mr. Douglas, and which is deceased, but we knew that he had a son, so we were able to get the son's DNA, which confirmed that he would be the son of the offender.
How did you feel after all these years being able to connect the dots and finally solve this?
Well, I just feel good for the family, and that's what I'm here to do.
Is he connected to any other?
Not to our knowledge. His DNA is obviously in the CODIS database, so if there is any other connections ever made, we'd be able to make that connection, but not at this time.
And his DNA was put in the CODIS back in the early 2000s, and obviously it's not hit at this time. But quite frankly, it's because people agree to let us look at their DNA. And the fact is, this affair from 1949, Douglas probably didn't even know these people. They're that distant a relative. But based upon that, then you have to build the tree and work forward to somebody that is a closer relative. And the only help you get, it's either on mom's side or dad's side, so you can eliminate half of the country at one time.
What does the son say?
He was just mortified. Just mortified. His dad had never been arrested, never had any trouble. And here we're telling him his dad he didn't just murder somebody. It wasn't like he had a fight in a bar and hit somebody. He stabbed and cut and mutilated this lady.
Could I say one more thing?
You can say anything you want, Mama. We don't mess with mamas around here.
She had been out, she worked the night shift, and she had gone out with some other nurses for breakfast. And I think she didn't get home until around 11 o'clock. I don't know what time she got home. But she had spilt tea on herself at the restaurant. When she got home, she undressed and put on this big, long robe. She always had a latch on her door. She would have never opened her door to a stranger wearing that gown, that house coat. Whenever he got in probably through the glass sliding doors in the back. But he was inside that house waiting on her when she got there. That much I know, because she would have never, ever let a stranger in.
Thank you very much.